Кому привет хотите передать?
Домой хотите передать? Все нормально. Скоро будем.
Ханты-Мансийский автономный округ, привет.
Республика Калмыкия, привет.
Ставропольский край, всем привет.
Азербайджан передаем привет.
Питер, Краснодар. Подожди, ему надо отдать, чтобы шли взяли.
Ну вон он, немец, немец.
Ovo je čudovljon. Hala. Čuva.往后面走站一点。Ну и что он做? Allah ta diye koş yat soysun. Kolunu uçtu. Bak. Deli olan bu.
Auf durch.
قطعة دجاجة وشتي.
حيز جرس. سمع كده. ثلاثة بجاي.
هو يعني مستوي هاي.
Moscow calls on Kyiv to order its troops inside Mariupol's Azov Stal steel plant to release any civilians who may be there and surrender. Moscow suspects that Ukrainian nationalist forces inside the factory could be using civilians as human shields to prevent Russian troops from advancing after no one passed through a humanitarian corridor set up on Tuesday specifically to evacuate the facility. Another limited ceasefire is to take place on Wednesday afternoon, but other safe routes within the vicinity have been used. We heard from some of the people who managed to flee from nearby areas.
We were living in the basement for 2 months. We are very happy to see you guys. Stay alive.
And now you are evacuating, right?
My sister and 3 nephews.
Right, earlier on Tuesday, Russian-led forces inside Mariupol launched a new assault against Neo-Azov troops. Most of the remaining Ukrainian forces in Mariupol are trying to hold their ground inside the vast territory of the Azov Stal steel factory. Their exact number is unknown, but they are reportedly in short supply of ammunition and food. Russia says the safe evacuation route from the area for Ukrainian troops to surrender has gone unused. Russian-led forces say they have been making very cautious moves towards the enemy positions.
Azov still has a high density of buildings, so the distance at which we are fighting is 100 to 200 meters. We are moving slowly but confidently. Our units have identified enemy firing points and directed a strike there. You can see the explosion right here.
RT correspondent Murad Gazdiev was near the front line at the Azov Stal factory, the last stronghold of Ukrainian nationalists in Mariupol.
Here on the periphery of the Azov Steel and Ironworks industrial compound, as you can hear, battle rages, small arms mostly, as well as tanks and armored personnel carriers. But the last few residential neighborhoods are all that stands between total encirclement of Ukrainian nationalists inside the Azov Steel industrial compound. As you can hear, the fighting is still ferocious, but from what we understand, nationalists and Ukrainian troops are running out of food, out of water, as well as out of ammunition. Morale is said to be very low there because obviously they're running short on supplies, but also because they invariably understand, many of them, that this is the end, that their commanders and those in Kiev, the government in Kiev, which is ordering them not to surrender, that they're throwing their lives away. Nevertheless, there are a core of radicals, fanatics among the nationalists in the Azov Steel compound, and they forbid any sort of surrender, any sort of negotiation. They want to keep fighting, as they hope, until a diplomatic, perhaps, solution is reached, by which they will be given a corridor out of Mariupol and into Ukraine, proper territories still controlled by the Ukrainian military, even though that is at this point incredibly unlikely.
Russian military expert and retired Colonel Viktor Baranets says Azov uses the same human shield tactics in Mariupol as terrorists do in Syria.
They continue fighting because they are ordered not to leave through the humanitarian corridors. That's one group of people. The second one is fighting due to their nationalist sentiment and their unwillingness to surrender and recognize their defeat. Some are not leaving because they're under a threat of being executed, as people who simply show a desire to get out of there are being shot. The militants are using human shields as a principal strategy, hiding behind the elderly, pregnant women, even children. There were a number of cases when parents grabbed their children and tried to escape through the corridors. The children were shot on their backs. There was a forensic medical examination proving that children were shot on the back. I'm not even talking about adults. This is a principal strategy of militants, as well as terrorists. Terrorists in Syria have done the very same thing.
While the situation in Mariupol remains tense, the UN Security Council held a meeting on Tuesday to discuss the conflict in Ukraine. Russia's ambassador to the UN commented on how he sees the West approaching the situation.
The West's concern for Ukraine and Ukrainians is opportunistic and selfish. Ukrainians are needed today only as cannon fodder in a proxy war with Russia until the last Ukrainian. At the same time, the West does not forget about its own benefit. So weapons manufacturers in Western countries are joyfully rubbing their hands, counting their own profits from the increase in defense orders.
15-member body that leads the United Nations convened a meeting, the topic of which was refugees created by the conflict in Ukraine. Now, the United States and its allies unloaded a lot of allegations and accusations against Russia. But there, Dmitry Polyansky, he took to the floor and defended Russia and called out and debunked a lot of the accusations that were being made. He went on to say that Russia has actually taken in refugees starting since 2014, when the United States and its allies toppled the Ukrainian government. And in total, 2.5 million people have fled to the Russian Federation as a result of U.S. actions in Ukraine. Now, he went on to talk about political repression in Ukraine and how attempts to portray Ukraine as being some kind of democracy being threatened is just simply not accurate. Political opposition forces are being rounded up and repressed and have been repressed. And for the past 8 years, they've been waging a war against their own population in the eastern regions. In Donbass, he called out the U.S. military-industrial complex. He talked about how a lot of the military hardware the United States has given to Ukraine doesn't even work. Some of these vehicles have not been functional, and they've just kind of been dumping them on Ukraine, and how the United States claims that it cares about Ukrainian lives, but at the same time, it seems to be trying to prolong the conflict and throw the Ukrainians' lives away in an effort to hurt Russia. Based on that, he argued that the calls for a ceasefire coming from the United States and their allies seem insincere, and there's a legit concern that this is simply an opportunity to let the extremist Nazi forces regroup and continue their efforts not just against Russia, but against Ukrainian civilians. Now, later, after we heard from the countries making up the UN Security Council, we did hear the Ukrainian representative get up, and he made a lot of accusations against Russia, one being that Russia is not allowing civilians to leave, a factory, and basically is enabling and causing civilians to be killed. This is what the Ukrainian representative said when addressing the Security Council.
The situation in Mariupol remains the most critical. Thousands of civilians are still in the city. Hundreds of them, including children, have taken shelter in the Azov Stal plant. They need immediate safe evacuation, and the Russian forces are well aware of this. Instead, the Russians deny all requests from the Ukrainian side, world leaders, and the UN high officials for evacuation corridors for civilians.
Dmitry Polyansky, representing the Russian Federation, spoke and explained very clearly that the presence of these civilians in the factory was hidden, despite repeated requests on the part of Russia to make sure that no civilians were in harm's way. And now Russia has been calling on Kiev to influence the fighting forces there and allow the civilians to leave the factory. So essentially, Ukrainians are being used as human shields by these extremist anti-Russian forces that have been armed and trained by the United States and Ukraine. Now, it's also important to note that at the Security Council meeting, China took to the floor and talked about the dangers facing the global economy and how the targeting and manipulation of currencies as a result of U.S. sanctions is having a very long-term and serious effect, not just in Russia, but in other places. And how the world economy is being badly affected by these moves by the United States and the escalation of the conflict. So it was quite a meeting at the UN Security Council, a lot of allegations unloaded against Russia. Russia did have an opportunity as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a body that was formed among the countries that defeated fascism in the Second World War. They had an opportunity to give their side of the story, and they presented facts that are being ignored in Western media and ignored in the tirades of Western leaders. So it was quite a meeting at the Security Council. Not a lot of unity among the countries there. Clearly some very different understanding of events on the ground in Ukraine, as a lot of people are becoming refugees and a lot of people are clearly suffering.